What is a stress fracture? Well, a stress fracture is a break in the bone. The difference between this type of a break and the more traditional break that occurs from trauma is that the fracture occurs because the bone is repetitively loaded. And so you get little microscopic breaks in the bone initially, and then if the repetitive load continues, then you'll actually get a break in the bone with all of the symptoms of a fracture. So why do stress fractures occur? Well, they are from repetitive loading. They can either be repetitive loading of normal bone in an excessive amount, for example, a military recruit going for a long hike that they're not used to, or it could be repetitive loading of weakened bone. For example, people with osteoporosis will potentially develop stress fractures if they repetitively load the bone and it subsequently breaks. A way to think about a stress fracture is that it breaks in the same way that you might break a paperclip, for example, by wiggling it back and forth over and over and over until it eventually breaks. And that's essentially how a stress fracture occurs. Why is the foot a relatively common place for a stress fracture to occur? There's a couple reasons for that. The main reason is that there is a lot of force going through the foot with each step. So through normal walking, you have 2 to 3 times your body weight going through the foot because the foot acts like a lever. If you throw in running, that goes up to 3 to 5 times body weight. So there's a lot of force going through the foot in a repetitive basis. Now the other thing is that there are different foot shapes. And what that does is it tends to focus force in various areas of the foot depending upon the shape of the foot. So you have a lot of forces going through the foot, you have a repetitive load with each step, and then different forces, different foot shapes focus the force in different areas. Where do stress fractures typically occur in the foot? Well, there's 4 common locations where stress fractures will occur. The first is at the metatarsal neck area for the 2nd and 3rd metatarsals. It occurs here because if the first ray, the part of the foot that the big toe is attached to, doesn't take its share of weight, then this area can be excessively loaded, potentially leading to a stress fracture. Second area is the base of the 5th metatarsal. This is an area that will get exposed to repetitive force, particularly in people that have higher arched feet. Then there are the sesamoids, and these can get repetitively smacked on, just like a hammer hitting that area, and these tend to occur also in people that have a bit of a higher arched foot. And finally, there are stress fractures of the navicular. The navicular is a bone in the middle part of the foot, and this area can be subject to repetitive concentrated force, particularly in people with a stiffer foot or people with a long 2nd metatarsal. How is a stress fracture diagnosed? It can actually sometimes be tricky to make the diagnosis of a stress fracture in the foot. You may get some indication on history that a stress fracture may be causing the patient's symptoms. If they, for example, have a history of increasing their activity levels, such as taking up a new running program. On the exam, the patients may have a limp, and they may have localized general tenderness in the area of the potential stress fracture. But sometimes the symptoms are quite nonspecific. X-rays are often normal, at least initially, until a callus forms. Callus is a new bone that would form in response to the fracture, but that can take a number of weeks to form. A bone scan, which looks at blood flow to the area, may be positive, as well as a MRI can also be diagnostic, as it will show increased edema in the bone that is associated with the microfracturing. So those are the ways that a stress fracture may be diagnosed. Well, usually the stress fracture has not displaced, so you're going to want to treat it with immobilization to allow the bone to heal, just like a regular fracture. The issue here is that these fractures often take many weeks to heal, 4, 6, sometimes longer weeks to heal. And during that time you want to protect the fracture with non-weight bearing or limited weight bearing through the heel to protect the area. And then once clinically it seems like the area is healed, then a very graduated return to activities is indicated. So you want to slowly ease back initially into the activities of daily living and then eventually back into increased activities such as sporting activities. Another thing in treating fractures, which is important, is to actually also address any reason why you might have got a stress fracture in the first place. If this is a matter of increased activity, long hikes and stuff, avoiding those or building back up to those would be one thing. But a lot of stress fractures occur in bone that's a little bit weaker. Somebody that has osteoporosis, or somebody has abnormal menstrual cycles in the case of women, that causes their bone to be a little bit weaker. And if that's the case, treating that bone condition ends up being very important. Finally, a word about surgery. Most stress fractures don't need surgery because the bones are not displaced. But if a stress fracture recurs, such as can happen with the fifth metatarsal stress fractures or the navicular stress fractures, surgery to stabilize the fracture with a screw is sometimes indicated.